Hello and welcome to India's World. The 11th summit of the Group of 20 G20 major economies has concluded in Hangzhou, China, in the midst of pessimism about global economic growth and prosperity. The G20 is the main coordinating body for economic policy in the world, comprising the 20 largest economies, accounting for more than 80% of global GDP. The group was created in 2008. The idea was that this group would reflect the power of the so-called emerging world also, in particular China and India. The initial meeting of G20 was held in November 2008, just after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in Washington. The aim was to ensure that if all the big economies pulled together, global growth could be preserved despite the financial crisis. The common program to do this was announced at the next meeting of the G20 at London in April 2009. However, skeptics claim that after the first two meetings of the G20, it has done nothing or precious little. To discuss the usefulness of G20 in the context of its 11th summit in Hangzhou, we have with us a distinguished panel of experts. We have with us Professor Ashok Desai. He's a senior economist, a well-known commentator on economic policy and a pioneer of economic liberalization in India. He was also chief economic advisor to the government and also my economics teacher, and I think I've disappointed him as a student. Then we have Ambassador Dinkar Khullar, an economist by training. He was India's ambassador to Azerbaijan, Austria, Belgium, Luxembourg and the European Union. He was also India's permanent representative to UN offices and international organizations in Vienna. We are also lucky to have with us Professor Nitin Desai, an eminent economist. He was also chief economic advisor to government. He was also Under Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs at the United Nations and has taught in several universities in India and abroad. I welcome you gentlemen to this discussion. Professor Desai, let me begin with you. What have been the major achievements of G20 up to now, and how effective or impotent is the G20 as a policy coordinating mechanism?
I think it's wrong to look for major achievements. What happens is that these leaders meet regularly once a year or once in 6 months, and it gives them time and opportunity to talk to each other and discuss the problems between the countries. I mean, these one-to-one conversations are extremely important. What happens in those sessions, we know if we just look at the reports that come out afterwards, very little happens. Everyone makes a speech, a very wise speech. That's about all. But I think one-to-one discussions are extremely important.
Okay. Ambassador Dinkar Khullar, would you say that while we have a global economy, we really have no global leadership, and global economic leadership works only in times of crisis, such as in 2008, 2009?
Oh, that's pretty accurate assessment of the situation. This began as a global economic superpower kind of idea. The real issue is that that when the crisis comes, anyway, the solutions are found by different mechanisms. It has, however, expanded its agenda and gone beyond just the pure economics of it. We are all familiar with the fact that the communique or the statement which comes out really says, hides more than it reveals. This is a classic case of documentation in our systems because the political undercurrents, which are extremely important, will not get manifested, particularly as we know in China. I would be surprised to see South China Sea mentioned in the document which emerges.
But it was mentioned by President Obama in his speech.
Many will mention it in the speech, but the document that emerges will not naturally reflect that. If it does, it will come as a surprise to me.
Okay, Professor Nitin Desai, does the global scenario today bode well for G20? Because if you look at the rich nations, they suffer from the citizens complaining about the incomes being squeezed, incomes are not growing, employment is falling, job insecurity is growing. You look at Britain, it hasn't recovered from the shock of a surprise Brexit vote. If you look at the US presidential election, all the rhetoric is about restricting trade and against outsourcing, against free movement of labor and capital. So, and there is a growing distaste the world over against for multilateral institutions which promote free trade or free investment. So, under these circumstances, what can G20 do?
Yeah, first, let me just correct one thing. The G20 is not the leadership mechanism for the world economy. When the world economy has been in need of some quick, sharp leadership, by and large, it has been provided by the US Treasury. If you go back to how the crisis was managed, it was nobody from an international organization traveled. It was the people from the US Treasury, Larry Summers then, and then later others, who managed to piece together a global package. So do not overstate it. Second, it doesn't have a permanent secretariat. It's a secretariat shifts from country to country. It's the one plus point that it does have is because these 20 fellows are going to meet, it compels their local bureaucracies to at least think through and work out what the other 19 are likely to come up with, what they will come up with. In a sense, it makes them slightly more globally minded than they would otherwise have been. Like, for instance, in India, because they went to go to the G20, they had the finance ministry had to set up, and then the external affairs also had to set up a fairly substantial mechanism to provide them with research studies on the issues before the G20. That's I would say is a plus point. But a mechanism, a meeting which does not have a permanent secretariat cannot wield influence other than through its impact on individual countries.
Okay, Professor Desai, there are two sets of countries in G20. Advanced industrialized countries and the so-called emerging market countries. Now, to say that emerging markets are the engines of growth globally today is no longer true, because except India, none of them have any growth momentum, and India also doesn't have a great growth momentum. So, are we faced with an economic crisis globally today which the G20 ought to be addressing, or they can just meet one-to-one and do bilateral talks in a multilateral forum?
I think there is a more general economic crisis, global crisis, in the sense that the economies are driven by innovation, and innovation has slowed down considerably in the last decade or two. In fact, it is close to zero, and this is what is behind the extremely low growth in industrial countries. Now, there is still scope for change of technology, improvement of technology in developing countries, and they could provide drivers for growth, which is why India and China have become so, shall I say, prominent in the world economy in the last few years, and why everyone turns to them. And I think it's important that these countries should talk to the old industrial countries somewhere. And G20 seems to me to be a good place to do that.
Okay.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Yeah.
See, basically today, what I've noticed in the UN at least was that it's the developed countries who started talking about fair trade. And it's some emerging markets who talked about free trade. We should be using this forum to maintain the pressure for the continuing relevance of the ideology of liberalization and free trade, because that is in our interests. And forums like this, it's very difficult for them to publicly state that they are against free trade. Okay. But privately, they are against it. Let's be very frank. Okay. So we should use this mechanism.
All right. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the usefulness of G20 in the context of the just concluded G20 summit in China. Ambassador Khullar, China's President Xi Jinping said at the G20 summit that the world economy still faces multiple risks and challenges, including a lack of growth momentum and consumption, turbulent financial markets, receding global trade and investment. Now, is there something that G20 countries can do about this collectively? Or do you think that economic growth, financial markets and global trade have a life and a cycle of their own?
To some extent, it is true that they do have a cycle or life, as you put it, of their own. But I think the dialogue amongst the major players does give them the advantage of being able to talk themselves through some policies that may work together. We mustn't forget that the summit is a culmination of a huge process of discussion at the level of the Sherpas. And the Sherpas are normally fairly good on the financial side. Now, they would, amongst themselves, be able to talk themselves into what is possibly good for the global markets, what is possible. Obviously, there cannot be unanimity on this, but they can come to consensus or agreement on some kinds of ideas, which will eventually have to be implemented by individual countries. The importance of US and China, no doubt, being very great. But I think I do see the possibility of some kind. It's like a mini United Nations in one sense.
Yeah. Professor Nitin Desai, a quick question to you. Is there a prescription for the world economy which will bring it back to the road, onto the road of strong, balanced and comprehensive and sustainable growth?
No, you just take what Ashok Bhai was saying, that if the root of the problem is a slowing down of the innovation process, then there's very little these 20 people can do about it, because that's an independent force. I doubt if there's any public policy which can suddenly stimulate innovation if the basic, some game-changing technology is not around the corner. So I would say that we are probably entering a phase of slower growth in the world economy and in world trade. Sensible policy makers must live with that reality and design the policies. If it doesn't happen, and it does grow faster, that's a bonus. But design your policies on the assumption that this period of slow growth is likely to continue for some time.
Okay.
As would be my advice to any rational, sensible policymakers. And there's very little that the G20, what they can do is at the edges. For instance, the Financial Stability Forum helps in some ways. If they actually get around to doing something on havens or tax havens, remember this, several of those tax havens are under their control. British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Macau, etc. They're under their control. So if they are serious, then they can certainly do something about that, and which will help certainly in terms of fiscal management. But none of that is going to make a huge difference to the prospects for growth. I completely agree with what Ashok Bhai is saying. There is a slowing down to live with.
Professor Ashok Desai, let's take the case of China. By 2020, China, they say, would be the world's largest economy, surpassing the US. So do you think China is ready to be co-leader of global economic management along with the US? And is the world willing to accept that leadership role of China? Most particularly, is the US willing to accept the leadership role of China?
You see, what is most interesting about these meetings is that 90% of the discussion is in English. It's only a few countries like prime ministers of, let's say, France and China who speak in their own languages and are translated. And those who cannot speak English are at a disadvantage. So when it comes to sort of decision making or writing final communiques and so on, English language becomes very important. So it seems to me that this world has been driven by Anglophone countries, now joined by Germany and China, and it will continue to do so.
Ambassador Khullar, do you think while the US will retain the technical and the intellectual leadership of the global economy, despite its clunky political system, as some people would say, the global economic might will actually shift to China? Or do you think has it already shifted? Because in terms of purchasing power parity, Chinese economy is already number one, some people would argue.
I think the global economic might will certainly move towards China. But Americans retain great dominance still over international political and economic agendas. So while China will certainly take over, I have no doubt that the Shanghai Stock Exchange will one day be more important than the New York Stock Exchange. But the fact of it is that the US will neither vacate the space easily nor will be compelled to vacate it, because there are too many players whose interest it is to prefer that the Americans maintain some kind of supremacy politically rather than allow it to go over to China. Politically, that is going to be a major question. I mean, economically, whatever may happen, the political space will still, in my view, be dominated by the US.
Do you agree with it?
No. I think people are Put yourself in the position of a third country, let's say India, and you have a choice. I'm a businessman, start strengthening my relationships with the US capital or with Chinese? Remember, a large proportion of Chinese capital is public sector capital. I would say if I'm interested in technology, if I'm interested in prospects for growth, etc., it's a no-brainer. I would certainly give priority today still to relationships with the US. The US's technological leadership should not be underestimated. It is formidable, even not just compared to China and India, but compared with Europe also. And so I'd say that has not gone. Yes, it's true that much of that technological capacity in the US is increasingly dependent on Chinese and Indian engineers working in the US. But as you and I know, that Indian engineers working in the US are clearly different from Indian engineers working in India in terms of their output and productivity. So I would not jump to the conclusion that the leadership is going to shift. But what will happen is the sheer dominance of the US will probably change. For instance, I mentioned that when the crisis occurred, the 97 and it was a US Treasury which was actually leading the global effort. That will change.
So you are in fact actually agreeing with what Dinkar Khullar is saying. You're not disagreeing with him. You're saying that there won't be any sharing of leadership either.
I think there will be areas where the US will want to bring others in. It has happened on the military side, for instance. It started long ago on the military side, where they said, look, enough is enough. We have taken on the burden. Now you Europeans better get your act together and start taking more of the burden on this. There'll be other areas where the US will want to share that burden, but I don't think that no country can afford to alienate Washington. You can probably still get to alienating Beijing.
Okay. We need to take a break at this point. We'll be back again in a bit. Stay with us. Don't go away. Welcome back. We're discussing the usefulness of G20 in the context of the 11th summit of the grouping in Hangzhou in China. Dinkar, you wanted to say something before you went?
I want to make on Nitin Bhai's remarks. The question of the military angle is very clearly demonstrated by the announcement by the US of the pivot, so to speak, towards Asia, Pacific, as opposed to Europe. I think, and I maintain the view that the US will not vacate this space easily. And as far as the technological skills are concerned, as Dr. Desai himself pointed out, Indian engineers are flooding to the United States. I don't see the same flood going to China.
Okay. Dr. Ashok Desai, in global trade, countries cooperate as well as compete, right? The United States has proposed the establishment of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTP, and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, in recent years. Now, while the aim of these platforms is to give the US greater leverage in global trade, might not this be seen by China as restricting its role in Asia Pacific militarily through the pivot and economically through TTP and TTIP?
It's not just that China will see it that way, it is meant to be that way. But people don't realize that these trade agreements, trade areas, have very little effect on world trade and on world investment. So I think they are sheer waste of time. India is always trying to get into all these things, but it's utterly useless. India should just ignore them and build up its own trade relations with, in particular, the Indian Ocean countries, East Africa, Southeast Asia, and Australia.
So if these trade arrangements are totally useless, as you say, why are they set up in the first place? Why invest so much political energy, political capital in setting up the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the TTIP?
You see, if you are a head of state, you feel you just have to fraternize with other heads of states. And when you meet over a dinner in your own capital, it's not much fun. I mean, many of them can't speak English or can't speak your own language. And it's terribly boring, let's say, having to have a dinner with a prime minister who doesn't eat. So it is better to meet in a group. And so this is why They like to meet.
So these are sort of clubs that are being set up.
No, I'd say
Nitin, this-
that, you see, basically don't see the TTIP and the other things as trade promoting things. They are
Trade
basically an
facilitating?
attempt at setting marks for the trade system which the US wants. We cannot get through in the WTO, and which it is getting through back to back. Benchmarks on intellectual property, benchmarks on investment protection, et cetera, et cetera. So they are frankly not meant to promote trade. They are meant to control trade. And from that perspective, don't look for too much. Don't underestimate the Chinese. The Chinese have got something else in the works, RCEP. The regional cooperation for economic, I forget the full time, the spelling. And Ashok mentioned India should not. Ashok mentioned India should not enter. Let me assure you, one of the things the guys doing those project agreements fear is India's engagement, because then it will slow down everything. You see, because of that is why they're quite happy if India doesn't engage. You see.
Dinkar, a major theme of this year's G20 summit was structural reforms to raise productivity and output. Now, if you look at Japan, Abenomics has not really led to the promises or delivered on the promises made. In the US, the big banks still retain their control and remain powerful. Europe has been unable to revive public investment and is actually going for austerity. And the commodity exporting countries have not been able to diversify their economies. So how easy or difficult is it going to be for these countries to implement structural reforms? And would these structural reforms then have the support of their local citizens?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. The problem is that structural reforms, or so-called structural reforms that are being talked about, essentially will meet a lot of local opposition. We know that in Europe, we know that in the United States, we know that in India, that reforms meet resistance locally. I don't think they'll achieve much on this. But let me just make one observation, since you're talking in a more general question of the G20 and its participation, and particularly India's importance. Participation in these clubs, as was just referred to, participation in clubs involve two things. One, it gives you the status, but two, it gives you some responsibility. And now, the problem is that sometimes India would have to take responsibilities as membership of these clubs of having to do things which outside the Group 20, they have G20, they have much greater support, and their views are much closer to them. I think climate change, of course, is one, but there are many others. So India itself has to be a little wary of how far it goes taking membership of every one of these prestigious clubs.
Professor Ashok Desai, is there a danger that the emerging economies may not be ready to make any adjustments to their development paths for the distant goal of future viability of global growth? Because their immediate problems are far too compelling for them to ignore.
This is true of some developing countries. Obviously for India, India's balance of payments is so strong, its fiscal position is very good. So it could attempt all kinds of things in the long term if it wanted. And this is true of a number of developing countries. I think it depends on how a developing country manages its own economy. This is why economic policy is important at every stage for every type of country. For small countries, the freedom of maneuver is less, but even then, they have to manage their economies.
Okay. Professor Nitin Desai, let me ask you a question. Prime Minister Modi has said at the summit, our challenges are common, so are opportunities. But is that really the case? Except in the case of climate change, terrorism and areas like that, how are the challenges and opportunities of, let's say, China and India the same? Or challenges and opportunities of the US and India are the same? So who are these Sherpas who write these speeches saying that our challenges and opportunities are the same?
It's okay. I wouldn't read too much into phrases like that. But really, to get back to this, incidentally, on the environmental side, having handled that side in the UN, as far as I'm concerned, this is the villains club. These are the people who are causing the problem. Somebody used to say, why are we discussing climate change with these 180 countries? Why can't we leave it to G20? The reason is, my problem is the G20. They are the ones who are holding back progress in the climate agreement. So if I hand it over to them, I'd be finished. The only hope I have is that the smaller countries, the island countries, the guys who are really going to be hit, are present in the
So
negotiations.
the 173 odd countries that have been left out
Are the ones who are going to help me in the context of climate, not this bunch of villains who are only interested in not doing anything very serious. So whatever be Obama's rhetoric and so on, what are they promising? Look, the amount that Obama has promised in his climate thing is nothing. Compared to what we need, it was nothing but an extension of his Copenhagen.
Right.
So I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away on this, but do not put everything in the G20 basket. There are a lot of things this world needs which need to be done in a far more democratic way, including the people who are going to be really affected. And climate change is certainly one of them.
Okay, on that cautionary note, we really have to end. We've run out of time. I'd like to thank all of you, Professor Nitin Desai, Ambassador Dinkar Khullar, Professor Ashok Desai, for participating in this discussion and telling us what G20 or the G20 club is all about. That's all we have for you today. We'll be back again next week as usual. Until then, goodbye and thanks for watching India's World.